Sometimes you just gotta say,
Oh,
I'm out of here for a day.
no way I can do that with people needing things done yesterday.
Yeah, I suppose. Easy for me to say, right?
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Moscow Board of Adjustments meeting for September 29th, 2020. This is a big crowd for us, given that we're in the same time as the presidential debates. So, anyway, now that we're here, I guess the first order of business is approval of minutes from the 17th. I reviewed them, didn't see any Scribners. Does anybody have any comments? Tim?
Yeah, I will not be able to vote because I wasn't there, but, but as I look at a roll call here, I didn't see Laureen's name as either member present or absent. Am I missing something there? It seems like she should be in one place or the other.
Yes, I was present at the last meeting.
Okay,
No,
This was
I
the
was not
meeting
at
at
the last-
5:30.
I was not at the approval meeting. I was at the last meeting of.
I think those are the minutes that we're talking about as the approval meeting.
Yeah,
For the
these are
daycare.
this was from the meeting that was the 5:30 meeting, just to approve the minutes.
Right. No, I was not, I was absent. I had a conflict that day.
By the way, hello, Lorraine.
Hello.
that's my only,
Any other comments?
I've torn myself away from an extremely amusing debate.
that's ominous.
Are we talking about these minutes?
Yeah, the minutes from yes, that's
Oh.
correct.
Well, if it matters, my name is spelled wrong.
Aha. Correct that. It's one change. Any other changes? Do I have a motion?
I'm happy to move to adopt the minutes as, with just the minor changes that we've identified.
I have a motion.
Second.
I have a motion. I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstain?
Aye.
Motion passes. All right, now on to the main event.
Good evening, everyone. All right, get this out of the way. Okay. Tonight, we have a public hearing for conditional use permit and variance request for 420 East 2nd Street. Maybe. Every time. There we go.
Got to click on the screen or else it won't go, and then it'll come to the presentation. Click the mouse.
Oh. Now we got it. Every time, this thing, it gets me. Okay. So, the proposal, the applicant, the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Palouse, is proposing to construct a 5,917 square foot addition onto the existing church located at 420 East 2nd Street. With this proposal, they would like to remove the existing administrative building, also owned by the church, located at 414 East 2nd Street. And the applicant proposes 7 new parking spaces to satisfy a portion of the parking required by the expansion, and has applied for a variance to waive the additional 11 parking spaces. This is the subject property. This here is the existing Unitarian church, and this here is the administration building that we that I had mentioned. It is surrounded by J. Russell Elementary, the McConnell Mansion here to the left, or to the west, and 1912 Center directly adjacent. So a little bit of background. The existing church building dates back to the 1900s. It was acquired by the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Palouse in 1985. The small house to the west was purchased by the church in 1988 and is currently used for administrative purposes. In September of 2008, the church applied for, and it was approved for a variance to allow a reduction in front and street side setbacks in order to expand an existing accessibility ramp to meet ADA standards. This is the church as it exists today. This is the administrative building just to the west. This is a rendering of the proposed renovation and addition, with the existing being here and the addition adjoining. The new addition would relocate all the administrative offices over to the addition to the building, remodel the fellowship hall. Second floor, again, would create more space on the second level. In the sanctuary, it would add 28 additional seats with the renovation. And then on the third level, the proposal includes a mezzanine, which increases the seating capacity by 43. The church is currently zoned R4, and that's the multiple family residential zoning district. Adjacent properties to the north and west are also within the R4 zone. Adjacent properties to the south, those are all medium density, which are R3. The adjacent property to the south is general business and is also the 1912 Center. Here is an image of the zoning, just for reference. Streets and access. The subject property has 146 feet of frontage along 2nd Street. That's both 414 and 420 2nd Street. It is a neighborhood street and has 80 feet wide with, or 80 feet of right-of-way with tree lawn, curb and gutter and sidewalks. Van Buren is also 80 feet, has 80 foot right-of-way with tree lawn, curb and gutter as well. On that side, it has 90 feet of frontage. The subject property can be accessed via one existing vehicular approach on 2nd Street. This driveway has been used jointly between the McConnell Mansion, the property to the west, and the property at 414 East 2nd Street for many years. This is a view looking down Van Buren towards the north from the street view, and this is looking down 2nd Street to the west. This is the vehicular access point that I had just talked about. Parking. So religious facilities are required to have one parking space per every 4 seats plus one per 100 square feet of open assembly area. The existing church does not provide any on-site parking. According to Moscow City Code, in part, it states that in cases where enlargement or expansion triggers requirements for additional off-street parking spaces are required only to serve the enlarged or expanding area, not the entire building or use. The remodel and expansion plans include an additional 28 seats in the sanctuary and 43 at the balcony level, resulting in the requirement of 7 new parking spaces for the sanctuary and 11 new spaces for the balcony level. The applicant has proposed a site plan showing 5 new parking spaces located on the west side of the subject property adjacent to the north-south access drive that is shared between the Unitarian Church and the McConnell Mansion. On the west side and the north-south access drive are 2 parallel parking spaces that are provided entirely on McConnell Mansion's property. The applicant has provided a recorded shared parking agreement between the Unitarian Church and Latah County, which is the owner of said McConnell Mansion. The agreement details the shared use of the 7 spaces and also allows for access rights. Per zoning code, deviation from the parking standards may be allowed with a joint use agreement provided that the applicant demonstrates that there's no substantial conflict between the principal hours of the building structure or the uses for which joint use of the parking spaces and/or lots are proposed. The parking spaces and/or lots for such proposed joint use is not any further than 500 feet from the buildings they are to serve, and up to 100% of the parking spaces or the parking lot required by this section for the church or an auditorium incidental to public or parochial school may be supplied by the off-street parking spaces and/or lots provided by uses primarily of the daytime nature. This is an image showing the parking plan. We have an ADA compliant space here, additional 4 spaces here. So those are the 5 spaces within the subject property. These 2 parallel spaces are the ones that are indicated on McConnell Manton's property. The zoning administrator is required to review and determine whether there's a substantial conflict between the principal operating hours of these 2 uses and the parking spaces that are proposed to be shared. And based upon their operating hours that have been submitted for the McConnell Mansion and the Unitarian Church, it's staff's determination that there is not a substantial conflict between the hours of operating of the 2 uses. Per the zoning code, the city will draft a joint use agreement that documents the decision, which will be signed and recorded with the Latah County Recorder. So this brings us to the variance request. 11 spaces are still required as part of the proposal. With no area on the property to create additional parking spaces, the applicant has applied for a variance to waive the additional 11 spaces. In the surrounding area, the 1912 Center to the south of the subject property applied for a variance to waive 113 additional off-street parking spaces for renovation and future occupancy of the remaining floors of the 1912 Center, which was approved by the Board of Adjustment on October 8th, 2019. Or not October, I'm sorry, August 8th, 2019. So it is staff's recommendation that we approve the proposed conditional use permit for 420 East 2nd Street with one condition, that the applicant enters into the joint use parking agreement, which satisfies the provisions of the joint use parking section of the city code for the 7 spaces that are proposed to be constructed as part of the proposal. And staff also recommends approval of the variance for waiving the additional 11 off-street parking spaces. And then board to direct staff to prepare the relevant criteria and standards. Do you all have any questions?
I have one right off the bat.
Go for it.
Why is the city recommending that what's the basis for the city's recommendation to waive the 11 parking stalls?
Going back to this slide here, talking about the 1912 Center, one of the criteria and standards is to not, I'll read it if I can get to it. There we go. The proposed use, where is it? Which one is it? Maybe it's not in this one, maybe it's in this one. There we go. Granting the variance will not be in conflict with public interest, property to persons vicinity of separate. I'm trying to read through it. There's one that specifically talks about adjacent properties and the ability for everybody at the same time to be able to have those variances. I think additionally, it is within the downtown neighborhood district where people do tend to walk a lot. The 1912 Center is there and doesn't have a lot of nighttime use either. So that parking lot could be used. There isn't a formal agreement, obviously. But that, and they have actually operated, the church has operated at the capacity that it currently is without any parking up till this point, so.
Any other questions, Marshall?
Yeah, Amy, I guess I got a couple of questions for
Yes.
you. And maybe we might need some of Mike's historical memory also. Do you know whether the Unitarian Church, aside from the variance for the setback, do you know if they're also operating under a variance for parking?
Not to my knowledge. Historically, I think that when parking standards were put into place, it was already existing. And so they weren't required to have any, so there was no variance. But Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think when it was constructed, it predated the zoning code. So the first zoning code happened to come into play around 1940, 1950s. And so the church building, and assume the house as well that's used as administrative offices were constructed prior to any zoning code that was in place with the city. So, yeah, in our research, there hasn't been any type of variance that was approved for parking. It was just for the ADA ramp on the east side of the building was the only variance that was processed on that property.
Okay. And Amy, as far as the ADA parking, when the ADA ramp was built on the east side of the property, is there an ADA parking place adjacent to that?
The ADA parking place that is proposed is on the opposite side, but there is an existing sidewalk that can take them up to that. So the ADA space is here, proposed. Over here on this side is where that ADA ramp was
But
constructed.
there's not one on the east
No,
side
there's
where
not.
the ramp is?
No, I believe it's just all off-street parking, or on-street parking.
Okay. And then another question, I don't know if the building department had a chance to look at it. With the increased occupancy load, did it kick in additional ADA parking requirements?
So we only require ADA parking as to what's provided on site. And so the ADA parking space that is shown here is the number that is required based on what is on site. Does that answer your question?
Well, isn't the ADA parking usually based on the occupant
Occupancy
load?
load, yes.
It's based upon number of parking spaces provided, not necessarily occupancy load. So there's a chart there, and once you get up to 25 parking spaces above that, then you're required to have 2 ADA off-street parking spaces. So right now, they're only at 7, so that would just require 1 ADA spot as part of that.
Maybe what Marshall's getting at is the parking stall count that we're looking at is based on the added load, not the full occupancy load, which they're evidently exempt from.
Yeah, we give you a credit for what you don't have. So we don't retroactively go back and require you to make the difference up, which when this, there would be no opportunity for expansion here because it would be substantial based upon the number of seats that they have in the sanctuary already. And so that was part of the decision in recommending approval of the variance was, this is a property close to the 1912 Center. It's already received a variance for a substantial parking reduction. It's a historic property constructed prior to parking requirements put into place. They have 80-foot right-of-ways, as Amy mentioned, on 2nd Street and Van Buren. Really just cuts down the buildable area on the property. And there was also an administrative building that currently had, no parking right now. And so, we thought that doing the addition on the west and providing more administrative space, not necessarily increasing that much sanctuary space as far as the seating, but just providing the addition to remove the administrative building and then doing the best to utilize the shared access drive to put in as much off-street parking as is probably feasible on that site. It was kind of good faith effort to be able to provide some off-street parking, but allow a reasonable addition. And we thought we would, looking at the criteria that, those were kind of the conditions that we had contemplated when recommending approval of the variance.
Okay. Well, I'm confident that the building department and the planning department will double check that before the plans are approved, so.
Sure, yeah, I mean, we have it right here in the zoning code, and it's just based upon the number of spaces provided. So, you run into that situation downtown a lot where the businesses don't have any parking spaces, but they do have higher occupancy loads, and so it's just really based upon what's provided.
Okay. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Mike.
Tim?
Amy, I have a couple of questions. As one who likes to see old homes that are well kept up, I'm just questioning the admin house that's going to be demolished looked kind of attractive. And is there any historic value to that building? Does it even matter? I know the city has a historic commission. I don't know if they're empowered to get involved in these types of things, but I just still wondered if there's historic value to that building since it's planned on being demolished.
I don't, Mike can probably speak to this. I don't believe it's placed on the registry, but Mike could definitely speak to that, whether it's a historic building.
Yeah, I'm staff liaison of the Historic Preservation Commission, and so the Fort Russell Historic District was actually expanded, I think it was a couple years ago, and they looked at this property, the admin building, and there was quite a bit of debate on the commission as to whether or not it was going to be contributing or non-contributing to the historic character of the district. I'd have to go back and look at the actual nomination, but I believe it was arrived at it was non-contributing to the historic character of Fort Russell Historic District. But regardless whether it's contributing or not contributing, there's no local ordinance that prohibits the demolition of such a structure. So, you know, that being said, the Historic Preservation Commission usually doesn't get involved in any type of recommendation, and there's no obligation to go before the Historic Preservation Commission. In some other communities, oftentimes you'll have a certificate of appropriateness that'll be issued by a commission to, you know, do an addition or restore or demolish a building, but we just don't have that in place. It's more of an honor, not necessarily an obligation, is what we have in place in Moscow.
Okay, Mike, thank you. Second question is, the staff recommends a condition of a joint use parking provision, and that's in addition to the already accepted joint use agreement between the landowner and the church?
Yes. The agreement between the landowner and the church is just for between the two of them.
Right.
The document that we would produce would be between the city and the Unitarian Church, agreeing that they would continue with that agreement. So it's, you know, on our end, taking, you know, making sure that that's buttoned up as well.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Amy. That's all I have.
Any other questions for staff? Thank you.
Alrighty.
You do.
Is now the time?
No, I'll, once she sits down, what the process is here, we'll have the applicant come up, describe their project, and then we'll open it up for testimony in favor of, and then testimony against or in general. And then if there's enough, the applicant is welcome to come up and speak again. And then we'll close the public hearing, and then we'll debate it up here. That's how we'll work it. Mike?
I just thought, can I add one thing to that? And it was in regards to the historic character of the property. There was a representative that had gone to the Historic Preservation Commission and asked for kind of their blessing as far as the proposed addition. And I believe the Historic Preservation Commission gave an affirmative that it was in keeping with the historic character of the addition onto the building. So I just thought I'd add that,
Okay,
that
so
point
they
on
looked
there.
at it a little bit differently. You said, lose the building, but we're expanding the historical characteristics of the church building. Is that what I?
They're just doing more of an appropriate addition that wasn't taking away from the existing church building. You know, the character of the church building is you know, essentially what they had recommended, they
Mike.
determined.
Thank you.
Can I ask what the basis for that decision was? Architecturally speaking, the addition doesn't match the architectural design of the existing structure. So it looks like an addition with the same roof pitch.
Well, it's like with the library. I mean, you have a modern addition on a historic Carnegie Library. You know, it's recessed quite a bit from the existing building, and speaking with the library. And so it's kind of those factors that were taken into consideration, you know, not, you know, I don't want to speak for the Historic Preservation Commission, but it was largely, you know, there were some similar features in the architecture, and it just wasn't protruding any further forward than the existing building, to take away from the existing kind of massing of the church building.
So theirs was based more on a spatial use, sounds like.
Partially,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, with that, I will open up the public hearing. Would the applicant care to come up and describe the project and the reasoning behind your conditional use and variance requests?
Good evening. Nils Peterson, 841 Travoy Way in Moscow. Staff, as usual, has done a nice job in presenting the project. The church is being sensitive in its attempts to understand the neighborhood and to communicate with some of its neighbors about what's going on. And the process has formalized what has been a little less formal on the property line with the county, the McConnell Mansion, to formalize that into several agreements about using those parking spaces there in order to achieve the 7 that would be needed to add the 28 to the sanctuary. I don't know, following on Marshall's question, whether the current ADA parking stall out on the street, is that Van Buren, the north-south street? It's currently there, it's painted blue, and it serves to get onto the current ramp. I don't know that that will be lost in this process, I would hope not. So my hope is that this is adding a spot, not just trading a spot around. But I appreciate your concern about the access for people with mobility impairment. Certainly as the congregation has aged, there's a few more of them, including me these days with my knees. The other thing that I have observed about the 2 spots that are on the McConnell side, they are not signed or designated as ADA, but they have the drive lane next to them to facilitate exit, at least out of the driver's side of the vehicle, and space to negotiate if you were using some sort of mobility aid like a wheelchair. Relative to Tim's question, on page 3 of the application, we say, the Fort Russell Neighborhood Survey dates the building, this is the 414, the little yellow house, between 1904 and 1928, and notes, as indicated on Sanborn maps, the single-story bay window on the facade elevation, the enclosed porch beneath an extension of the roof on the facade, a corner, gable bay on the southeast corner, and this covered stair on the west are all non-historical. So I think in that process, yeah, it was there, it's old enough, but people have fiddled with it a bunch. And so the value as a clear piece of architecture is maybe been blurred. So I think that would be part of your consideration. Well, maybe we're not losing much because, I mean, it's, in my lifetime, it's been like that, but it's been fiddled with. So I don't really have other things to say to elaborate on what staff said unless there are questions that you all have for me.
I have a question.
Okay?
And it's kind of in reference to what Mike had mentioned earlier about a reasonable addition. This addition is 3 stories, and it appears to be the same size footprint. So in terms of an addition, it's a substantial amount of square footage addition. Can you elaborate on why that is? It's clearly more space than the yellow house, so I'm assuming that you've grown out of both spaces. So can you clarify what the need for that much square footage is?
So the sort of administrative and religious education for children functions have struggled to find spaces in the current architectural configuration. The yellow house was a house. It transmits noise if you try to use the living room for one thing and the dining room for something else. It's kind of awkward, and the spaces you walk through each other and stuff like that. So one of the gains in the proposal is to have some actual spaces where those activities, religious education for children, can happen in defined space. Some of it happens down in the basement in some kind of carved out little rooms. It's been kind of a struggle. That allows, the other is to allow the fellowship hall under the sanctuary to kind of become a better space for doing those post service activities that people do, as well as some midweek things. There's the quilting club and stuff that, which, to do that, kind of pushed some of those functions out into the addition. The other important thing about the addition is the circulation and vertical circulation, the elevator, et cetera, to make the historic building more accessible than it is now. So the congregation debated for several years this process, and one was do nothing. One was, what's the least we can do to try to make a few things better? Then the next was, could we do a big addition, what you're seeing proposed, on this site, solve a number of things quite well, or do we abandon our location and move to somewhere else? And in that process, the do nothing was problematic because there are a number of accessibility issues with the current structure for worship and for the fellowship hall. The do something looked like you could spend a lot of money and not have much more than Band-Aids on it. You'd put an elevator tower somewhere and whatever. But what really troubled me was the thought of moving out. And this is the conversation I think we should have about protecting our well-occupied urban core. At one time in the 90s, I thought, yeah, great, go out there now where Toyota is, because there are a number of Pullman, no one would walk to that church. No one would, or a few would bicycle to that church, out if you imagine the Toyota site. Even if you found a green field around the edge of Moscow, the walking would go down substantially. So as I came to think about it, was like, no, this is actually the best strategy to keep the maximum amount of, in our kind of institutional core that surrounds that part of downtown, right? You've got the courthouse, church, high school, 1912, another church, Methodist church, library, Russell School. A whole bunch of institutions in there, which make for reasons for people to be coming there and activating the street, make a good rationale for the bus that runs on 3rd. And so staying seems to be the sort of climate-oriented and community-oriented thing to be doing. So I think as they chose this path, as opposed to a greenfield solution somewhere else, that this one is a better contribution to the city.
Okay. I have one more question. As I read through this, the variance is based on reconstructing the balcony, but it is also a bid alternate, which in my experience, we provide bid alternates to clients because we're unsure of the bidding climate and whether or not we can afford that part. Were there any discussions with your group regarding the value of a 3rd floor of the addition versus the balcony? Or was that balcony just an extra, if we can get it, it's of lesser value than that 3rd floor? Because without that, this variance, we wouldn't have a variance without the balcony. And so I'm wondering what the value of that is to your constituents.
So I think I heard two ideas. How valuable is the balcony? And what if you, from a cost standpoint, what if you traded off the 3rd floor in order to afford the balcony?
Correct.
Okay. You are correct that the balcony is a bid alternate. The congregation thought, well, we're worried about the total cost. Let me ask staff how long that variance is valid, that this church could come back and use it as opposed to building it today. In other words, the bid alternate could be exercised later.
Yeah, I mean, typically the variance is good for 2 years, I believe, with another extension of a year beyond that.
Okay.
I think we would view it as long as you start so the variance is included as part of that portion of the project. I think as soon as you started really any portion of the project, assuming that you're just gonna to do the addition and not necessarily the mezzanine initially, I think we would say that that's vesting you for that variance at that point, even though the mezzanine's not being constructed. I mean, the board can certainly put a limit on that if they wish to a number of years that the variance is active for or is permitted for. But I think we would say that it's vested at that point of when you start construction of the addition.
Okay. So that would be the start point on the clock. May I go speak with the head of the building committee to see what they would think about from the budget standpoint, which is not from the variance standpoint, the idea of shortening the building and putting the money elsewhere? So, no, the building committee really didn't think about trading off the third floor from a financial standpoint. And the reason for the size of the structures, as I indicated, they're moving a number of functions out to make the historic building more functional. And those are occupying space in that addition.
Okay. That answers my question. I just wanted to make sure that the bid alternate, which is driving the variance, the rest of the project is not, is literally a secondary, if we can afford it, we'll do it. Not a subject to change with what is being part of base bid.
Right, so I think there's two pieces to the rationales here. One is that the foundation and footing pieces to do the balcony are in the base bid. Just because when you're down there in the basement, you may as well do the right thing, right? The church is committed to the idea of getting there in the long run. This summer, they started a process to say, well, let's just get the CUP, see how the bids go, come back for the balcony, which we then came to understand would require another CUP modified to deal with the factor of the variance. And so it was like, well, let's roll all of this into one application rather than bite it off piece at a time.
Marshall, you had a question?
Yeah, Nils, I guess I got kind of a two-part question for you, Nils.
Okay.
First of all, could you tell us about the timing of events that will happen at the church, currently, and then what you anticipate with the new building?
You mean like uses, not the construction site?
No, not the construction, the actual use of the building.
Oh, okay, sure. So the primary use is Sunday morning. Sunday worship, 9:30-ish to a 10 o'clock start to noon to, whatever, 12:30-ish while people straggle away. So that's the primary use. Then there are, as you've probably attended, a wedding or a funeral or a whatnot that happen randomly during the week at various times. And historically, there have been several groups that meet there, small groups. There's a quilting group, and I think Food Without Bombs has been cooking meals there for a while. Those sorts of more focused things, which may be sporadic to some extent in nature or maybe somewhat calendared. There's a men's group and another, a small group kind of discussion stuff that happens. But your primary biggest draw is Sunday morning. And then when there is, annually, there's a fundraising event for the church itself. I think it's a Saturday evening for that. So it's that sort of pattern. I don't think it will change.
Okay, Joe, can I continue?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so Nils, I applaud you for approaching the county and entering in an agreement to use some parking on the McConnell site. Was there any discussion about using the actual courthouse parking lot for a specific time? I mean, that parking lot is not used on Sundays. Was there any discussion with the county about any of that?
I was not aware of any discussion with the county. I'm not sure it's close enough to count. Is it within the 5?
Have to be within 500 feet, which it wouldn't be close enough. I
Wouldn't
mean,
be
they could
close
certainly enter into an agreement, it just wouldn't be able to be counted towards the off-street parking requirements.
Okay.
More than once, Marshall,
The city parking lot would be within 500 feet.
the city one down right over there.
That's already been dedicated towards the 1912 center at certain times.
I remember that also. I just didn't know that.
Thanks, Nils.
Yeah, okay. So what I was going to say, Marshall, is a couple of times I've thought, well, the other way the church solves this problem is they buy one of the small houses on 2nd Street and they flatten it and they turn it into a parking lot. And when I think about, not that some of those are architectural gems, but when I think about that, is that the way we want this core part of the town to go, where every other building is flattened so that there's a parking lot to serve the adjacent one? That seems like an undesirable path to head down.
Okay. Any other questions for Nils? Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anybody else care to come up and speak in favor of this, either of the applications? Please state your name and address for the record into the mic.
Victoria Seaver, 121 North Lily. By the way, there is a street ADA spot on Van Buren, and we are putting in an ADA elevator. So that was for the ramp, the street side. Now they're going to have a parking spot, and they can access it through a flat entry and get to the elevator. They wouldn't really want to go all the way to the ramp. They'd use the elevator on that west side. So, okay. So while we have both a CPA and variance before us, the only issue of note I see, and is true with many proposals, is that about parking, and which surfaces here in regards to the balcony in the sanctuary. So I'm focusing my comments on that. As I break this out, and I dovetailed everything, criteria 1, 5, and 7 were all good. Criteria 6 here focuses on day-to-day operations. The balcony presents no change in the number of people and vehicles on a daily basis. There used to be a balcony, and by building up, we are not sprawling outward. Criteria 2, which is where I see we remove the old house, which is really hard to retrofit. It's a challenge. And it allows us to add on to the church, making it more functional, and it preserves the historic church. That drawing does not do justice to what it will look like. Criteria 3, we have called attention to the fact that we do actively promote reducing the carbon footprint, which is also a city goal. And if the church is way out there somewhere, like Nils said, everybody's got to drive. There are a lot of people who walk, carpool, and bike now, and we want to keep it that way. We might be able to add more biking racks. That would help too. Under criteria 4, under the daily and normal use, the balcony is likely vacant, except that it does offer alternative space if you want to take your small discussion group of 6 to 10 people and meet up instead of down. Who cares? That's fine. And it's more choice in spreading out of church seating. If you tried, we looked at this, I just remember being in congregation, the additional part doesn't, you can't see into the sanctuary and the church. If you put people there for church, they can't see anything that's going on. So that's not a trade-off, as I recall. Okay, and the The use of the balcony would of course be used for the special services, like Christmas service, there's more people. The annual Gospel Sunday service, there's more people. A large funeral, there's more people. Small one would be downstairs in the fellowship hall. But that's not a day-to-day operation. So finally, for us, the church is a congregational site for spiritual and social interaction, but even more than that, for many members, it is a place and a base to offer community service, like Family Promise, we're involved in that, where being with us, they have pedestrian access to town, and that's important. And we have a lot of small groups, like Neil said, that meet there when they don't have a site of their own, and we're easy access for them. We have little educational workshops, also very small, different things like that go on, folk dancing, he mentioned some of those. So this is not just about adding some seats in the balcony for church service, it's also about functionally updating the building capacity. This church has work to do, and it needs a better space to get it done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Al Poplawski, 2108 Vandal Drive in Moscow. I'm a longtime church member and also chair of the building committee. I just wanted to mention some things that were touched on, but one of the really driving forces of this project is the ADA accessibility. The current church has the ramp, and that's how ADA can get to the sanctuary, but if they want to go down to the fellowship hall down below, they have to go back down the ramp way over there by 2nd Street, down the sidewalk and around the building, way over to the west side of the basement fellowship hall entrance to get in. So that's a real limitation. And secondly, the yellow house has actually no ADA accessibility. So that was a real driving force behind the project. The second thing was the religious education. The current facilities are that yellow house, that small old house, is our religious education house. Actually, we don't have any administrative offices over there. So that facility is really poor for classroom space. So the addition, one floor, the top floor will be new classrooms, new RE classrooms, and the bottom floor will be administrative offices. And the current administrative offices are in the basement of the church, historic church building. So those will be moved to the addition, and that's why the addition is so large. We're moving administration from the church building to the addition and religious education from the yellow house to the addition. So that's the reason it's large footprint, 2 stories. I think that's all I wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody else care to speak in favor of this application? All right, for those of you that would like to come up and speak against it or just in general, you are welcome to do so also. Go ahead in.
Good evening, people. My name is Ann Marshall, and I speak to you as an architect, as an architecture professor, as an architectural historian, and as someone who has lived in Fort Russell for 24 years.
And can you give us your address?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
419 East 1st Street.
Thank you.
And I am, in fact, one of the neighbors, and there was discussion about communication with neighbors, but I was never communicated with, interestingly. So, I have a few issues with this. One, contributing the yellow house, it's a contributing property within the Fort Russell Historic District. It erodes the character of the whole district. This is a really important neighborhood in our city, and I think probably everyone in the room would agree with that. And so I think we have to be really careful about demolishing the historic buildings within that district. Number two, not only will the loss of this property be a problem, but the proposed new building is out of scale with the homes on the block, out of scale. It's too big. And there was discussion in the first presentation of this project about the neighbors. There was not a single mention of all of the residents who are on the block. So think about it. This is, you know, you're talking about landmark buildings, but you didn't mention that there are a lot of people who actually live on the block. And so you all should be thinking about them. The proposed, so this massive new building is going to block sunlight to neighboring property much of the year. So a loss of sunlight in many communities that are really thinking about the quality of life and the quality of the environment, they consider and they look at daylight studies and the shadowing of a large building onto other properties. That's number three. Number four, the proposed parking and shed at the very edge of a residential property makes this a particularly bad neighbor. The excavation that's required at the north edge of the property jeopardizes the stability of soil and the fence of the neighbor to the north. For the proposal of the parking area, that's going to require excavation. And I have to say, the drawings are not particularly complete or accurate regarding where the ground line is, either on the front of the building, that is on the south, or if you look at the building, if you look at the drawings on the west, the drawings of the west, the ground lines are sort of vague, very vague. So in terms of how the building hits the ground, the overall height of the building, and what needs to be excavated to allow this parking to happen is also not really described very accurately. Now, I have to say the thing that really, as a neighbor, that bothers me the very most, I'm really not looking forward to this at all, but the proposed parking and grade cut, it's going to destroy two significant mature trees on my neighboring property, including a sequoia. And a fir. These are large, mature trees, and if you're putting parking there, you are going to destroy them. And I thought that respect for living things is central to Unitarians, so I'm really kind of disappointed about this. It doesn't look like it's been very well thought out. That's under criteria 2. Criteria 3. The noise and pollution to the neighborhoods from this parking, the parking itself will be a nuisance. And I also will say that whenever there's been construction, UU construction, our sewer pipe gets crushed because it runs through that alley space. So it's like, oh boy, can't wait till another construction event. So I have to say, I don't think I can say anything else, but except that if you're talking about what you're doing to the neighbors, you say you're communicating with the neighbors. I was never communicated with. The well-occupied urban core of Moscow, I agree that needs to be protected. I agree with that. And I also understand the idea of needing an elevator, but I just think that can be achieved with a smaller, less massive building with perhaps higher architectural integrity than what is shown on the drawings. And I guess that's it.
Thank you. Actually, any questions for that?
Yeah, any questions?
Ma'am, you said the scale of this project kind of dwarfs the general neighborhood, but the house to the west of it is a mansion.
The house is, but the houses on the other side are not. So this actually, and if you, I was going and looking, the drawings are showing as if the ground line is flat, but it's actually, this street second is not flat. And with the building, the church is a certain height, and this new building is just humongous. And the height shown, the 40 feet, that's assuming a flat line. It's actually going to be a lot taller. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about in terms of excavation, from the alley driveway space, and you probably can't see these black and white photos, but there's about a 4-foot drop between where you're proposing to put these ADA spaces and the drive. There's some grade issues that need to be dealt with. It's not accurate. And when I look at this elevation is showing Second Street as if it's flat. It's not. It's at a slope, and that changes a lot. It means that building is going to be much more voluminous than what the drawing implies in terms of its height over the ground.
Joe? Now, your credentials are an architect?
Yes, I'm a registered architect.
Okay, and what is your expertise?
Well, I've built skyscrapers. I have built homes. I built corporate headquarters. I worked for an internationally known firm in Connecticut. I did high-rises in Chicago, New York. I did corporate headquarters. So I've actually done a lot, and I've worked in Connecticut, California, Louisiana, DC. I've worked in a lot of places.
Okay. And as an architect, you understand that these are just draft preliminary drawings and they're not working drawings for getting a permit.
I actually do understand that, but if my students were doing those, I would send them back because they haven't correctly shown the ground line, because you need to actually think about the context in which you're designing. And if you're not showing the ground line accurately, then whatever you're drawing on top of it and all of those relationships are not going to be accurate either. So that's a concern. So I guess, so maybe I should say something positive to the church. I appreciate you're trying to provide ADA, you're trying to stay in the core. And I actually agree with that. It's just that the massiveness of the building and what you're doing to the neighbors, the people who actually live on that block, it's really horrible.
Joe, can I ask staff a quick question?
Sure.
In relation to our comment?
Sure.
Amy or Mike, as far as building height regulations in the zone, the proposed addition meets those requirements?
It's shown at 40 feet, and so that's the maximum building height in R4, which the property is located in. So it's going to be the average grade at the front of the building. So they're going to have to average the existing church building as well as the addition. There could be some portions that are over 40 feet on the addition, as long as the whole thing averages out with the grade of Second Street.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike.
The problem is the way it's drawn, it's actually going to be more than 40 feet. If that's the design, it's because the grade drops substantially, and that's not shown on the drawing.
Yeah, on the preliminary drawings.
Yes, which should be more accurate.
Okay.
Thank you. Would anybody else care, hold on, to come up and speak against or neutral to this conditional use or variance permit? There's a couple of you that haven't had the opportunity to speak. You're going to get it if you want it. All right, seeing no one, Would the applicant care to come back up and make any additional comments before we close the public hearing?
Thank you very much. So I'm in your packet, looking at the west elevation. The page is numbered A12. And I would just comment that what I see in there is, in the backyard, there is a retaining wall anticipated of some sort. It's not quite clear how those ground lines connect, but on the next page, or in mine, page A11, you can see, again, there is a transition, as mentioned, coming from the level of the church and dropping down. This is, of course, a view in the backyard. My understanding is that the reason you don't see that grade in the front elevation, the page A9, you see some transition over on the far east side of the church shown, is that the church intends to create essentially a level patio area in front. And so that the base of the building is footed against that level patio, and then as you come out towards the street, there will have to be a transition, whether it's a slope or a little retaining wall, to make that, in order for there to be sort of better social spaces out front of the church, both a playground area for kids and more of a social patio space. So that may be why the drawings, as you're seeing them, seem to have these inconsistencies. And regarding the height and massing, I take staff's word that they and the architect who's done this work have met whatever the city's criteria are. Obviously, they will be met in the process of getting a building permit. So those things you should rest assured on. And then the last comment about, one of the comments was about the impact on neighbors to the north. You can see, this is page 3 of 6 in your packet. I'm looking at, staff's prepared the site plan. It's a zoning overlay. There's clearly one house to the north that will have a very different experience. There are 5 houses total along that block. The one north of the church will see no change in what's south of it. The next one will. And then there are 3 that won't. And lastly, I'd comment, I was the guy who got given the job of taking the spray can and the tape measure and going out and figuring out where all the parking spaces would sit after the surveyor had come through and marked various corners. The church, the yellow house, it appears, embarrassingly perhaps, has a fire exit stair out of the basement that has been constructed across the property line. And so when you understand where that is, and the parking is all to the east, that is, the bumper of the cars will be at the property line, and the front bumper will be ahead on church property, under the existing yellow house. So now there's the yellow house and a courtyard that the church has built, and then the church building. Essentially, that's sliding to the east, and the parking is at the property line on the west edge. And the grade can't be changed very much in the shared alley, because it's the shared alley. And it needs to be relatively level from the parking spaces from the McConnell Mansion across the drive lane, across the parking spaces for the vehicles. So I don't think you're going to see much excavation going on there. If you drive through it, you will see that Currently, what do we call it? The vertical curvature, as you come out, it's too steep. My car bumps its front bumper. So there will have to be some kind of regrading to make a better transition from Second Street up across the sidewalk and up on there. But I don't expect you'll see a lot of excavation.
Anything else?
I have a question for you, Nils. The yellow building that's there right now, how many stories is it? How tall is it?
I don't know how tall it is. It has, its main floor is several feet up above the yard level. And then it's 2 stories is maybe a little generous. The upper space is where the bedrooms are, and they have that kind of, this ceiling sort of effect. So it probably is a full 8 feet somewhere in there. So there's 8 and 8. 3 or 4, you're up to 20 plus some roof pitch, 26, 28 feet tall, I don't know.
Thank you.
Tim?
Nils, is I'm learning that the new addition is gonna be taller than the yellow house. Is it the same footprint, square footage wise, on the grade level? Or is it the size of this box that staff is written around, or is that just a property line?
I think I see which drawing you're on 4 of 6, page 4 of 6?
Exactly.
Okay. So staff has shown you in red the property boundaries.
Okay,
And the new structure will have a slightly larger footprint than that and moved eastward towards, so that it
Sure.
adjoins the
so it's
church.
gonna join the church,
Mhm.
yeah. Okay.
And so that it gets inside of the zoning setbacks.
Any other questions for Nils? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I see that Ann would like to talk some more. I'm going to allow that, but it means that Nils will be able to come up and rebut, but this is not intended to be a debate. So please state your name and address again at the podium so that the mic picks you up, and add what comments you'd like.
My name is Ann Marshall. I'm at 419 East First Street. And actually, I guess I just have 2 quick comments. One is about the excavation. So, Nels, as you rightly say, there isn't going to be excavation in the alley itself, but that means that if you go from the alley to where there are going to be parking spaces, if this is from the alley, and then this backyard space is about 4 feet high, and so that's going to have to be excavated. In fact, if there are going to be parking spaces there, and by excavating, you're going to undermine the edge of my property. It's going to ruin the fence. It's going to destroy the trees.
The mic may not be picking up your comments, Ann.
I'm sorry. Okay, so my concern is, and I don't dispute what Nell said, that there won't need to be excavation in the alley per se, but to go from the alley into the area where the parking spaces are shown on the plan, right now, that's about 4 feet higher. And so that will need to be cut out 4 feet, which means would be a 4-foot cut right at the edge of my property line. It would jeopardize my property, my fence, and it will destroy 2 important trees that are right on the edge of the property. So, and people are asking, how big is the yellow house? It's substantially smaller than the addition in its height. So this was today in all its glory. And if
Ann?
you're talking,
Will you hand that to Annette, and she can pass it down along?
absolutely. And
Those
I
of us
can
that-
also
yeah.
pass down this. Yes, please. Showing the 4 foot. And, so I guess I'm I'm really concerned about the trees and the edge of my property. I really, and you're showing a shed there. Right now, there's a playground back there, which is great, and now you're gonna put the playground, you're gonna put kids playing right near the street, which, as an architect, I probably wouldn't do in terms of design. And I guess that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Please come up, maybe come up together, because applicant always gets the last word, I guess, so to speak. So if the two of you would like to both state your name and addresses into the mic so that that gets picked up, and then maybe address those last comments regarding site.
Nils Peterson, 841 Travoy.
Al Poplawski, 2108 Vandal. There's been this mention of these two trees. I believe I know which tree she's talking about. There's one that is a fir tree that is further to the east that I don't think will be affected by the construction at all. It's got to be at least 20 yards, 15 yards from where the parking spaces will be. Now, there is a sequoia tree that she mentioned that is very close to her property line, and it's close to the alley. And believe me, we are concerned about trees, and we will work not to affect these trees. As Nils mentioned, you can't just take the current spot where the grade changes and is 4 feet higher, and we have a retaining wall, and say we're going to make parking spaces in that whole area, because our parking spaces will start at the property line, which is further to the left. How many feet, maybe? A number of feet. So there may be some excavation into that 4 foot higher area, but it won't be for the entire parking spot length. These are. Oops. And I want to assure her that we will be considerate of that sequoia tree. We value that also. And we'll do our best not to affect it in a negative way. So.
Okay. Thank you both. With that, I'll close the public hearing.
Joe,
And
can I ask staff a quick question first?
Sure, yeah.
Mike, is there any public improvements involved with the property required?
As far as I know, there's, all the improvements are there as far as curb gutter sidewalk. If there's any type of public sidewalk that's in a state of disrepair, then it'd be required to be brought into compliance as part of the project.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike.
actually, in conjunction with that, that's along Second Street, but this is showing an entry coming off of, what is it, Harold? On the west side? Is the access into that parking?
That's on Second.
That's on Second Street?
There's a through access, so there's a street to the west of, so a street to the west of Van Buren.
Adams
Street.
Street. So are there any street improvements required on that street to have a drive access behind the?
It's already
That's an
existing.
alley there, I think, or it's a private driveway.
It's already existing on the north side. So
What
if
I'm
you,
saying is it existing and meets current code to a current construction project?
well, it's gravel currently, so it's not paved.
So would that fall under public improvement?
It's on private property, so it wouldn't be public improvements, no. There's already an existing curb approach onto the public right of way, and so that would remain. You know, this portion of the property is the only portion that would be required to be developed per our parking lot standards, not necessarily the access drive all the way from Adams Street.
Comments? Who wants to start?
So we've closed the public?
Yes. Close the public hearing, yes?
Got a suggestion.
Sure.
I don't think we should tackle these both with one motion. I think we should consider the conditional use permit first and then the parking variance second.
I completely agree, and that actually was the intent, because that's how our findings of fact and meeting minutes are gonna have to support this afterwards anyway. So, with regards to the conditional use permit, obviously we have our 7 criteria. And then when we get to the variance, that's actually 3 different criteria. So, let's focus on the first and deal with the conditional use permit.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
You certainly can discuss the conditional use permit first and then the variance second, but as far as any type of motions, the variance would have to come before the conditional use permit, because one of the conditions of the, or one of the criteria of the conditional use permit is that it meets all development
Yeah, that's
standards
it.
of the city code, so.
We run into that before. and it
You
seems
run
like we
into
always
the
take
issue with
variance
off-street
first.
parking not being met for the conditional use permit if you go that route, so. But you can certainly discuss them in whatever order you'd like, you just can't move forward with.
Thank you. Yeah, that's correct. My bad.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Well, I want to talk about the variance a little bit then.
Okay.
My concern is the additional impact on the neighborhood as far as the parking goes, because not only could we grant a variance for this project, the 1912 Center is working under a variance, the high school is operating under a variance, and I believe the library is also, aren't they, Mike?
I know they constructed the parking lot for the addition, so that was the property directly to the northeast that they ended up constructing a parking lot for. I can't definitively say one way or the other whether or not they received a variance. I believe that the parking lot satisfied the addition, but certainly the current building, didn't meet parking requirements as they currently
I was under the
exist.
assumption that they used part of City Hall parking lot for the library also, but either way, I know the 1912 Center is working under a variance for the parking lot, and so is the high school. And so my concern is the added impact on the neighborhood, but when you think about the uses and the times of the uses, most of the time it's on Sundays or on the evenings, and probably much more rarely during the middle of the day when the high school would be in session, or even though the county courthouse is more than 500 feet away, it is still an option to be used during those periods of time. So my only concern is the additional impact of the on-street parking with the neighborhood.
So to put this in perspective with the 3 criteria, what you're voicing concern about is criteria 3, which is granting a variance will not be in conflict with the public interest or injurious to property or persons in the vicinity of the subject property. So that's what you're talking about. With regards to the other 2 criteria, we have to address criteria 1 in order for criteria to be addressed with whatever concern we have for criteria 1. So let me read criteria 1 to get input from you on. Special conditions and/or circumstances exist which are peculiar to the property, such as size, shape, topography, or location, which are not applicable to other properties similarly situated in that same zoning district. So we have to satisfy criteria 1 in order to answer criteria 2, which is because of the aforementioned special condition of the property, which is whatever criteria 1 becomes. Application of the provisions of this zoning code would impose undue hardship and would deprive the property owner of rights commonly enjoyed by owners of other properties similarly situated in the same zoning district. So, to me, criteria 2 is easy if you have criteria 1, because criteria 2 is saying, we meet criteria 1, so we want to be able to build out our space based on that criteria. So, in my mind, we need to address criteria 1 and criteria 3.
Well, I think we can address criteria number 1 when you look at the slope and the grade changes on the property. It's not a flat piece of property, it's more difficult to work with. They have to do certain retaining walls and things to enable that to accommodate the parking lot. So if you say, we could address criteria number 1 by the slope of the property.
But that's not all the other properties there have the same slope issues. They've already got retaining walls behind them. So I don't know how that would make it different from the adjoining properties. Steve? Tim? Annette, thoughts? Putting you on the spot. This is a unique one that,
Let me think a minute now.
theoretically, the public hearing is closed, but Nils, if you will come up to the mic and ask your question into the microphone, I will allow it, as long as no one else objects.
Nils Peterson, 841 Travoy. Perhaps it would be useful to think about the adjoining properties as the adjoining institutional properties, as opposed to the residential ones. And the adjoining institutional properties are all historic in character and are completely landlocked. I mean, they were built into the lot that they have, and are all, we talked about the library bought a house and flattened it, put in a parking lot, Methodist Church, McConnell Mansion, and Historical Society of the 1912. They're all struggling in their historic existing little footprints of lot. And so it might be worth thinking about those as the neighbors, as opposed to the houses as the neighbors.
You're not considering
Thank you.
people who live there? I'm sorry, I'm really offended.
Joe, I've got
Yeah.
something to add. One of the conditions I think that is peculiar to the neighborhood is when you look at the public right-of-way width on Van Buren Street and on Second Street is greater than most residential streets. Most residential streets are what, 50 to 60 feet public right-of-way, Mike?
Usually around 60.
And we're looking at 80 feet and 90 feet. So I would say that is one thing that is peculiar to this property. It's on a corner lot with public right-of-way greater than most residential streets.
Mark, thoughts?
Well, I'm way out of my area of expertise on this because I'm not an architect. I was just trying to think of, just thinking of 1912 building where, I mean, we literally granted a variance to get rid of, what was it, 113 or 100 plus spots. And I was just trying to think of what we did a year ago that how we consider that to be a special condition or circumstance in that property that was not applicable to the other property similarly situated. Do you remember what we did? What was our justification on that?
I think what it was is it's easy to articulate that the conflict is resolved in the fact that the operating times, the events that the different buildings are used, are not ever, normally not in competition with each other. So we're multi-purposing the use of all this parking lot. I'm quite sensitive to what Marshall's saying. I don't know if, what the point here is every one of these projects we keep adding more use that's along public parking, and as a person who has a house in downtown, I can be sensitive to that. I wonder if, we talk about it later, if we need to just kind of come up with some kind of a understanding amongst us as to how much of this we keep tolerating, because it's only finite, and sooner or later, it's gonna be a real problem.
Well, I think we kicked the door wide open when we granted a variance for 100 and, to waive 113 spaces. I mean, I saw that one coming a year ago when we did that, and so,
Well, the other thing to consider here is we're looking at waiving 11 parking spaces, but that's, as I pointed out earlier, is only related to a bid alternate to create balcony spaces. So those seats are what we're addressing. We're not addressing parking that the rest of the congregation would require had this been because it's being excluded. So we're trying to find a reason to allow
Sure.
a shortage of 11 when the reality is it's a church, it's in a downtown historical area, and it's going to use up all the street parking. It just, it
Well, and
does. That's what it does.
I think, I heard testimony that, that really the use wasn't gonna be enlarged in terms of, we weren't gonna see a problem in terms of, you know, a huge population, you know, coming in terms, I think that was my understanding, is essentially gonna remain the same. We're not gonna see a difference in parking and things like that in terms of the number of people showing up. I hope their membership increases. That's, I think, the goal of most congregations, but my understanding of the testimony was that it wasn't anticipated to create a huge influx in the number of people attending at the time.
Marshall?
Yeah, Joe, I'll give you a little history too with Second Street when the 1912 Center was remodeled. We'd actually looked at vacating Second Street. The city engineering department looked at vacating Second Street and actually turning that into a parking lot. And it was decided then that there wasn't enough space between the curbs to adequately add much parking other than the on-street parking that was already there. But I'm comfortable with satisfying criteria number one when you looked at the public right-of-ways, which are larger than normal, and if you include topography in that.
Joe? So I kind of agree that when we're talking about the 1912 building, we talked about the fact that when Jean was here, she was saying that it wouldn't always be used at the same time. Those
Right.
little buildings or all the different rooms in there would have, would not be all used essentially at the same time. Only the great room, and it wouldn't hold 113, I think, or need 113 parking spaces for that great room that they have there. That was part of it. I know that in this neighborhood, we have McConnell Mansion, which probably doesn't get a tremendous amount of traffic, certainly not on a Sunday, except for the social events. And you got Russell School there, which has parking problems during the weekday. You got the high school, which has parking problems during the day. But on Sundays, I don't see it as a problem from a standpoint of parking with the school districts. There's talk of maybe partnering with another entity, McConnell Mansion or somebody, to get some more parking spots. I don't see why they couldn't partner with the 1912 building to get parking spots on Sunday for parking spots. But again, we already gave a variance to the 1912 building for not having the parking spots that they actually do require.
And 1912 building does use it on Sundays fairly often.
Yeah. I'm sure they would do, yeah.
But the high school doesn't.
Well, even if we considered that, is that the same right-of-way offset on all four sides of that block? Because it would be different from any other similarly situated.
Well, I'd say on two sides, but it doesn't. The McConnell Mansion goes up to Adams Street, so the right-of-way on Adams Street doesn't affect this project. But I think having it being a corner lot with two sides having extreme right-of-way is enough.
Joe, could you articulate the problem we're trying to deal with here? Because I'm afraid I've kind of lost it there.
Okay. We have to approve 3 criteria to pass this. The first one, and I'll read it again.
And where are you, what page you're on?
Well, I'm reading it off of page 2 of 4 of the application for the zoning variance. I'm not reading their justification, I'm just reading the actual criteria itself. And it's special conditions and/or circumstances exist which are peculiar to the property, such as size, shape, topography, or location, which are not applicable to other property similarly situated in the same zoning district. Now, I will say that I think the zoning district changes on different sides of that block, does it not? So that's one consideration.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that, because that was my recollection as well, so.
And then, Tim, to follow up, the second criteria basically states that because of the aforementioned special condition of the property, which whatever, if we can identify one for number one, application of the provisions of the zoning code would impose undue hardship and would deprive the property owner of rights commonly enjoyed by owners of other properties similarly situated in that same zoning district. So basically, whatever we identify as the issue in one is preventing them from being able to do what they would normally be able to do without a variance for item two. And then the third one, I'll repeat again, is something that Marshall has touched on. Granting of the variance will not be in conflict with the public interest or injurious to property or persons in the vicinity of the subject property. So I want to address a couple things from my dealings with site plans. I don't think shade's going to be an issue because this building isn't as tall, it's downhill, and a 45-degree angle off the top of that building for spring and fall. I don't think it's going to affect those on the north. However, there will be substantial excavation. I'm concerned about granting the variance for the 11 stalls because what is being shown for the 7, I challenge that that's not doable for a couple reasons. One, if the goal is really to provide an ADA stall, to meet ANSI, it's entitled to, it's supposed to be nearest to the front door. It's also not just the stall, but the approach all the way to the door. So there's a lot of grade change there, and it can't exceed, well, the parking itself can't exceed 1 to 20. The sidewalk can exceed 1 to 12, but it would have to have rails. So it's doable, but there's a substantial amount of grade work that's going to have to happen in order to get those 7 stalls there. Now, what I don't know is what effect that has on the plant life. Trees grow with sidewalks and streets well within the canopies. I'm not an expert on that. But there is a substantial amount of grade there to make that stall that's furthest away. I mean, you can paint it whatever it wants, but it may not meet code in terms of a stall. So that's my concern. And the city has not been given drawings that accurately reflect enough for them to approve or not approve at this point in time, which is always to our detriment because we get drawings that aren't building construction drawings. They're schematic design.
But Joe, why would you pay the price to get construction drawings if your variance or your conditional use permit wasn't approved?
Do you want me to candy coat the answer?
Well, I know what you do for a living.
That's why I'm not going to candy coat it. The architect should have provided enough information in this schematic design set to at least address that. Ann is correct, the sight lines around the property don't match the conditions. And so it's hard for us to make a decision on something the city couldn't even review at this point. That's my uncandy coated version. I think this set of schematic drawings should have needed a little bit more.
Well, this is from a civil engineer here. He hasn't stamped the plans, but this was submitted by Hodge and Associates, and so that's the reason they ended up locating the ADA space to the very far to the north, is because of grade on the property. And you can see that dark line is intended to be a retaining wall. So that'll be a retaining wall on the very far north in order to grade that space out to meet the required no more than 2% cross slope on the ADA space.
And so now I'm going to put you on the spot. So the city is going to approve that as an ADA stall even though it's not the closest one to the front door?
It all depends on technical infeasibility of the site. So we'll have to take a look at that. You know, a lot of times it's really up to the applicant whether or not they want to jeopardize getting fined because it's not the closest to the door, but we could certainly take a look at technical and feasibility as far as.
You're
where
right,
it's
and then there are
located at.
two other big exceptions that allow them to not actually meet that. So they're doing the best that they can, is the other side of that
Yeah.
argument.
Well, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but the ADA parking space does have existing standards, but the other parking stalls don't, do they?
No.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
So
So
as
they
long as
could
you
be
make that one nice and flat, and then deal
then the other ones
deal
could be
with the
sloped.
sidewalk and the curb cut and railings if you need it for ramps and all those things to the front door, you can get there.
Yeah.
It's just not the closest one. But as that grade comes out, it dips down a lot when you get to the curb. So it's probably the most technically feasible location.
But even if the others are at a 45-degree angle, there's no standards for them.
Right, but just looking at that drawing graphically, that drive aisle doesn't look like it's 20 feet to me. How wide
Not
does
required to
the,
be, for angled parking spaces, it's not required to be 20 feet, it's only 15 feet,
only 15 feet for one way?
correct?
And how deep, off the top of your head, do you know what the angled stall is, that horizontal dimension?
They're
Because still
45,
graphically, that doesn't look like 15 feet.
those are 20. That dimension,
How wide are the two parallel stalls? Are they 8 or 9?
those are 8.
So that doubled would be 16, so that might be close to 15. The point is, that is super duper tight, and it's going to require excavation.
Yeah.
It just is.
Yeah.
Marshall?
Okay, Joe, well, let's get this thing off of dead center then.
Fair
Let's, I'd move approval of the variance with the condition that the applicant sign an agreement or enter in an agreement with Latah County for the spaces on the McConnell Mansion site. And the reason, my reasoning behind it is that because of the use time of, the main use time of the church on Sundays and Saturdays, Sundays, and evenings, there is other facilities that within a reasonable distance that parking could be available.
So
That-
to clarify your approval, you're stating that, I'm not clear what you're stating as our criteria 1. Criteria 2 would fall in place, and then you're saying criteria 3 would not be in conflict with public interest.
Yes. But
So
I'm not.
what's criteria 1? You're,
And I think we could work with staff to develop the criteria, but my motion is to approve the variance with that one condition.
And the condition again is, had the city provide an agreement? Was that?
No, the city doesn't provide the agreement. The agreement is between the applicant and Latah County.
Oh,
I don't
Latah,
think the
excuse
city
me.
has anything to do with it other than to make sure that that is recorded.
So before I get a second on that, this is for the variance, for the 11 stalls. And what our criteria would be is that basically the size of the lot doesn't allow a parking lot that would accommodate 17 cars. It would only accommodate 7. And so because of that, your variance is to approve criteria 1 based on size
Size and
and
the over.
and the overall.
The
Location of the.
enlarged, also it's a corner lot, and there is enlarged public right-of-way on both on Van Buren Street and on Second Street.
Okay.
I'm sorry, in the county, I mean, I know they own the property, so, the adjacent property. So, what was it, Marcia, you want an agreement between the applicant and the county?
Yes. The
Yeah.
county owns the McConnell property.
Right.
So the agreement would be between Latah County Board of County Commissioners and the applicant.
And what are they agreeing to?
Well, that agreement was actually in our packet.
They've already agreed to a joint use permit, use agreement.
But it hasn't been signed yet, has it?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Is it signed, Mike?
Yeah.
So
The
it-
Yeah.
the condition, I think that you're referencing is the agreement between the city and the Unitarian Church to continue with that parking agreement. That does have to be drafted by staff.
Yeah, that's what they
Approved by the
state.
city attorney.
That's the staff's condition that they recommended.
Right, but that's relative to those 7 stalls for the conditional use permit, because it includes those 2 that are on the other
It
person's
includes
property.
those.
Correct,
yes.
correct.
Correct.
So I don't know that it's pertinent to the variance.
Okay. Well, if.
It's already included in the,
It's already included.
it's already been done, yeah. in
Okay,
the
it's already
packet.
done.
Yeah.
So then we don't need that condition.
So can I get you to summarize or restate your,
That's easier now.
yeah, your
I
your
move
motion?
approval of the conditional use permit.
For the
I mean, of the
variance.
variance, excuse me, of the parking variance.
Okay. Based on size, topography, and offsets, right-of-way offsets. I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I second it.
I have a motion. I have a second. All in favor?
You want to have further discussion?
Well, we've got a motion. We have a second. I suppose we can have further discussion, but we
I'd like-
can't do anything until
I'd
we
like to
either
hear from-
deny it or,
I'd like to hear from the thoughts of.
Again, this is just for the variance, not the conditional use permit.
correct.
Yeah. I'd like to hear from some of the other board members.
I mean, okay, I'll shut up.
Well, I think, as I was saying earlier, that the use of the building is going to be primarily on Sunday, which is not going to, the school district isn't going to be using that area, which is heavily used during school hours. But that area of town gets a lot of heavy traffic for parking off-street, obviously, for various reasons, because of the other entities that are located in that area. But Unitarian Church has been going for many years, and I can't see that's gonna change the use of the buildings and on Sundays. So this is for an improvement, an increased seating capacity, and there's what we're discussing. And so I can't see any reason not to, approve the variance the way it is.
The way I see it is the church community and the neighborhood is already accustomed to providing parking all around the church, on the street, people walking, bicycling to the church on Sundays, and they only need that vast amount of parking for Sundays on a regular basis. So I don't see how 11 stalls will, that they don't provide 11 stalls, I don't believe it will be that much of a problem. People are already accustomed to that lack of parking.
I'll play my hand now. I've been the negative Nelly up here because it's not requiring parking. But from my perspective and opinion, adding a parking lot in this area of town would be extremely detrimental. It's not what that whole community is about. It's not about parking lots. And they're used to dealing with parking without them. So I'm more concerned about those 7 than giving up the 11. And the second reason for that is, this project is being called an addition, but in my opinion, adding the balcony back is actually a restoration of an existing condition, which unfortunately, if it hadn't changed and was still being used as a balcony and not an office, it would be excluded with the others. And I love historical buildings, and so to be able to restore what it really is would be my preference. So I don't have an issue with the 11 parking stalls. But with restoration, it's unfortunate that the rest of the building doesn't have the same architectural arched windows on the new addition. It just, you're restoring one part on the inside, but you literally are adding an addition to the other. So there, I've played my hands. Right. But in terms of the variance, I would never be in favor of adding parking stalls anywhere in Fort Russell. I just think it's the wrong thing to do. I think we should find other, or challenge everybody else to find other options than to pave paradise. That's a horrible cliche, but it's, paving is not, in that area, it's just not a good option, in my opinion.
It's a very finite problem. I mean, it was well-written in the fact that this area was all laid out and developed before people had cars. And yet the uses are the same, residential and a church that's just as old. I mean, so there's no other option other than either allowing them people to use the roads or demolishing historic buildings to put in pavement.
Right.
And vertical parking garages and, But, you know, the conversation I'd like to have later on, maybe, though, is, so the next week we get another one from St. Mary's. I mean, or, you know, these just keep adding on, but yet there's only so much right of way along the street. So when is it too much? And we don't have to answer that tonight, but somehow or other it seems like it's out there. It's only a matter of years.
Right. Mark, comments before we?
Oh, I
Do our
agree.
ayes and
I was
yays
following
and
along
nays.
with what Steve was saying. I think that was part of my point, is I don't think, and I agree with that, I don't think by allowing this, we're gonna increase the use any more than it's already at, and I agree with you. Adding parking lots is a bad idea in that section. But that being said, I mean, you know, I saw this coming a year ago when we, like I said, I think we kicked the door wide open. And but that being said, I support Marshall's motion as well, so.
And Joe, I really like your point about, you know, the balcony previously being used and having all that seating capacity, and it wasn't, and now it is again. So, yeah, it is too bad it couldn't just be grandfathered into the now, what's being proposed now. I think that was your point.
And this is Lorene. I really am here.
I was wondering if you're still hanging with us.
Oh, yeah, I'm still here. And this facility is actually used by the it's a major gathering point for events. It's not just for Sundays, but you know, I think by increasing the seating, increasing the capacity of the sanctuary, they're also increasing the space for, you know, it makes another space for community events and for us to come together, you know, when it's possible for people to gather socially again. But it's not actually an increase of impact on the neighborhood. And it's not like the churches, it's not like a school saying we're going to add 3 classrooms and now we're going to be suddenly used by 60 more people. It's not really a proposal to accommodate any larger a group than is currently using it and needing it. But I do understand about, you know, putting another paved parking lot into the Fort Russell residential neighborhood where I'm also a resident. It is a little bit painful. I'm curious how those spaces are going to get used during the week, whether it's going to provide, who's going to be using the new spaces?
Who's going
Monday
to
through
police it
Saturday?
from the high school students?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Lorraine.
You're welcome.
We have a motion, we have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Okay, that's unanimous. So the variance,
I'd move that we direct staff to prepare a draft relevant criteria and standards for us to look at it.
agreed. So there's a motion. I need a second.
I'll second.
Second.
It's mine. I'll second.
A motion, I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, that is unanimous. Okay. Now to the conditional use. Here's where I'm going to play my hand now. I won't vote in favor of the conditional use unless it's required that we have a site plan that protects all of the surrounding properties and shows appropriate grading that the city can approve as compliant. Just throwing that out there as a condition of approval of the conditional use. And I would base that on let me get back to our 7 criteria. I want to say it's the nuisance one, an effect on surrounding areas,
Yeah.
because to me that is.
And Joe, I understand what your condition, what you want, but that would happen anyway. I mean, when the city reviews the site plan, they reviews the setbacks, they reviews the grade. That's all part of the review process. I mean, you can put it in there as a condition if you want.
I stated that it needed to show protection of the surrounding properties. The trees. And that may actually even fall under tree ordinance. I don't know, but those aren't in the right of way, right? So they're not, those
Doesn't apply
are
to-
interior to the block.
It's on private property, so the protection of the tree, it really is, it'd be a civil matter between the two property owners. I mean, the city doesn't even get involved in private property issues between two property owners. I mean, if they cause damage to the trees the root system in some manner that caused the trees to die, that would certainly be a private dispute between the neighbor and the Unitarian Church.
But you can make permeable surfaces. I don't know how well a permeable surface would work for the ADA stall because it doesn't meet the smoothness. So, but I still think, since we're expecting them to put a parking stall in the middle of a lot, which I've already stated that I don't think parking lots in the middle of this area are the wisest thing to do, but we can't just keep kicking the can down the road and not stating, hey, you're making a space bigger. People that can't walk or ride their bike, they have to drive there. So keep them off the street. But this is not enough information for me to say, yes, that will work and it won't be destructive or a nuisance to adjoining properties.
So would your condition be that the city accept a site plan to protect neighboring properties? Would that be the motion? Or that a site plan be provided before you would even vote on it?
No, if it's a site plan that's provided by a licensed landscape or civil person that can demonstrate that those things are being protected.
And who's going to be the judge?
Well,
The city. The city.
well, it either comes in with a
Building
valid
department, planning
stamp or it
engineering
doesn't.
department.
I mean,
your condition, so I mean, what if you don't agree with our architect and the landscape architect. I mean, I'm sure that can be produced.
Right.
That's required before you get a building permit. So whether or not it's gonna meet, Joe, your
Well-
expectations, though, is I think the issue, and that's.
I don't think I could, that would be an unfair restriction, because, and we
Yeah.
go back to the way this building looks. I wouldn't have drawn it that way, and probably wouldn't have drawn it that way. I actually know who drew this, and drafted it, and, it's like art. Everybody has a viewpoint. All I'm asking for is enough information from a licensed professional that we're protecting properties. Mike?
So, building plans have already been submitted by an architect and civil engineer, and they went through the process. Those haven't been issued, of course, because this hasn't been approved by the board. But a civil engineer had submitted all those plans showing compliance with city and building code requirements. So that's been in place. I don't know how we offer protection of neighboring properties. I mean, it's inherent in certain portions of the building code and city code that you can't cause damage to neighboring properties, but as far as the tree aspect of it, I mean, you would have to hire a certified arborist to draw up some type of plan in order to protect those trees, and I don't know if that's going to affect the applicant's plans as far as the retaining wall in the parking lot. So I don't know how we,
I think all you did was just strengthen my argument. There's no reason why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they have an arborist verify that they're not doing damage to an adjoining property? That's what this condition is. And granted, code is the minimum that someone has to do. It's not the maximum. It's the minimum. But the minimum should show that that's not destructive, or we don't meet that criteria.
And Anne also had the concern for, she mentioned that when there's been construction happening in that neighborhood, that there's been sewage problems also. So I don't know how much that would affect the neighboring.
Well, that's a harder one for us as a group to address,
Right.
simply
Joe,
because construction is always a nuisance. I mean, it just is.
Joe, as chair, you usually don't make a motion, you're just sharing your thoughts.
I don't,
with
I'm
us.
just sharing my thoughts. I'm not making a motion. My role up here is mediator. But I still have to vote. And so I'm just throwing out there what I think we should do in the best interest of this application. And we still have to address those 7 criteria. And I would have a hard time voting in favor of any motion to approve the conditional use permit without addressing that potential nuisance to adjoining properties. And that is my suggestion of how we would address that comment, because in general, I'm in favor of this conditional use permit. It was the variance I thought we wouldn't pass, to be honest, but we still have to address the 7 criteria.
Right.
And so I'm just trying to throw out some help as to how we would do that.
I'm a little bit, I certainly made a mental note when Professor Ann talked about the size of this building and either being consistent or inconsistent with the local community, and I'm relying on the applicant here. It says, proposed project will retain the historic church in its current form and will replace the small house with a new structure that matches the design elements and materials of the church. The resulting structure will be harmonious and continue to fit within the varied tapestry of the neighborhood. Do we all agree with that, from what we've heard today? I'm a little bit unsure.
Well,
Especially when I hear architects.
that's kind of what I was just saying. We could put a piece of art up on the wall, and all 7 of us would have a completely different take as to whether it was good or bad. But whether it meets code, that's,
True. But that's where we come in, is with these conditions. Code is, like you say, black and white. And then when I hear members of the board who are architects talk about the fact that they aren't too impressed with the compatibility of the new add-on to the existing church. Well, that gets my attention too. I'm just trying to process that piece right now. I just hate to, when this is all said and done, when we all walk down the street and say, look at the size of that thing. We're not surprised.
But it doesn't require height variances based on its height. It does step down with the grade. The grade lines just aren't accurately drawn. And they'll have to meet the average grade point. So in terms of how tall it is, and again, it's downhill from the north side, so how they address the finishes, that's beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In terms of the house, I mean, Historic District says that it's not. It is a unique looking house, but for what the owner uses it for,
It's not functional.
it's not functional, and
No.
it would be very difficult to take a home of that vintage and try to restructure the inside for the uses that they want. So it's
And like what
their
Neil
house to tear down, I guess, is my
And what Neil
take.
said also about, do we want a newer, cleaner structure, hopefully that is similar to the church, how the church looks? Or do we want to keep the little yellow house and keep putting Band-Aids on it? I think that potentially could make the neighborhood look more run down, keeping the yellow house.
Well, again, that's actually not really one of our 7 criteria.
No, it's not.
How they
That's
use it
just
and
my
how they
thought.
maintain it are really not our purview. Marshall?
And Joe, I noticed something strange on the site plan here. When you look at sheet A1, it looks like the site plan takes funny jogs in there, Mike, and that's pretty atypical for a block, isn't it?
You talking about the rear property line?
Well, I'm looking at, yes, the rear property line.
Yeah, it's like the yellow house property line is 2 feet or 3 feet shorter to the north than the adjoining properties, and usually those are in alignment. Is that what you're?
Yeah, it just seems oddball that it had a funny jog.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it on the screen. It makes a jog. I mean, it's probably 10, 12-foot jog.
I mean, I just noticed that
That
It's
jog does,
atypical.
though, on page 1 of 1, it's further in, the record of survey actually shows that jog. The lot to the north is 80 feet deep versus the lot to the west of it is 77 feet deep. And then the corner lot's only 70, so
it's accurate.
that part of the site plan is correct. The rest of it, that would question, but,
Another question I want to ask the staff, if I could, Mike or Amy, and I'm sure I know the answer to this, but I got to ask it because I've been in public settings before, and you hear quite often about neighbors saying, well, I never got the word, I never heard about that this was going to happen. I assume it's the city's ordinances and requirements to notify neighbors in writing of projects like this within a certain radius. I mean, I know you can't make sure people see it, but there obviously, the notices went out. I'm just asking the very
Yes.
basic questions, just.
Yeah, notices for the conditional use permit go out to anybody, any address within 600 feet of the property. For variance, it's any adjacent property. And all of those went out at the correct time.
So Joe, your concern is 3
Right,
and 3.
where it says injurious
Yeah,
or
injurious
detrimental to a, yeah. That you were reading my mind. I was hoping
Yeah.
someone would actually go to the last page and look at these 7 and address them and make a motion. So we can go.
And your proposal would be to have a condition in there that talks about, is it the tree? Or the other, you talked specifically about the tree.
Well, I guess injurious or detrimental to adjoining properties would, I mean, that in and of itself should protect sewer pipes. It should protect trees. It should protect sidewalks, right-of-ways, curbs. I mean, anything that would, it looks like there's a huge grade change between these properties, between the south side and the north side of the block, based on that photograph. So it looks like there's retaining walls already there in place between these properties. But I don't see how this new construction could be allowed if it doesn't take into consideration that protection of the adjoining lots, which looks like it really is only one lot, because the lot the existing church is on abuts the corner lot on the opposite side, and there's really no new construction happening at that point. It's all happening between the second lot that's 80 feet deep and a shared use with the adjoining property to the west.
I'm sensitive to your concern. And I'm just
Well, I
trying
mean,
to-
look,
Yeah.
items 1, 4, 5, 6, and 7, we've already discussed that they're not issues. Item 2, will the character of the proposed use be in harmony with the neighborhood and surrounding land uses? That just comes into play with the whole, what looks good to me, what looks good to you, what looks good to them. But it's still a church, it's a church function, that's I would say it's in harmony in terms of its usage with the neighborhood. So that, again, it just gets us to 3, which, in terms of public testimony, has been the key issue, is just protection of adjoining properties. So, like I said, I'm the mediator up here, but I'm kind of monopolizing this meeting. I would like somebody to address these 7 and make a motion, even if it doesn't pass. It's a motion to build on.
You know, I think that the word, the use of the phrase nuisance has to be, you know, I think they really did mean it in its legal terms. And, you know, nuisances I think of as incursions, you know, something that would alter the ability of the surrounding neighbors to use and enjoy their own property. And I don't know that anything rises to the level of nuisance here. And the tree issue is completely separate from the nuisance thing, unless you're talking about a tree that's actively encroaching or threatening other structures. So I would move acceptance, subject to the conditions stated by the city, and also by the filing with the city of a detailed site plan, including input from all appropriate professional disciplines.
Lorena, are you making that as a formal motion?
I am.
I
ha-
second it.
I have a motion, I have a second.
Said I didn't quite hear the motion.
Lorraine, could you restate that as a motion?
Okay.
Marshall?
It's moved that the conditional use permit is approved, subject to the condition imposed by the city of the shared parking agreement, and additionally, subject to filing by the applicant with the city of of site plans certified by all appropriate professional disciplines.
So her motion is to approve, including recommendation 1 from the city and recommendation 2, based on what I was suggesting, that a
Yes.
site plan from a licensed professional that shows that the site plan is not going to be injurious or detrimental to adjoining properties. So that's the motion. Do I have a second?
I second.
I have a motion, I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Wait, excuse me, Mr. Chair, can I get clarification? The part that you added at the end, injurious or detrimental to adjacent properties?
Mm-hmm.
Can you add some clarification on what that means?
Well, I think you'd want to look at the language of the the criterion itself and read it fairly narrowly. I was just worried that the word nuisance was getting, its meaning was getting expanded beyond what it would be, how it would be interpreted in an administrative law context or a judicial context.
And I guess as I'm sitting here thinking about it, I see Mike's concern because this puts the city in a funny position to, when we say an appropriate professional, and Lorraine, I think I understand where you're going with the idea of trying to protect the adjacent property. And I think what Mike's trying to do is get some clarification on what exactly, there's got to be a checkbox that the city can,
Yes, it's a
Checkbox
checkbox. I
and
think,
say
Joe,
you-
you're as an architect, I think you might be the more apt than me at wordsmithing that bit. I just wanted to add on your suggestion as an additional condition. So, but why don't you describe your condition? You state the motion there.
Okay, Mike's concern is the city only has to receive and review and approve a site plan that meets basic code requirements.
Well, we do require from a licensed professional. So this is a commercial project. So we require a civil engineer to submit the site plan. We require an architect to submit the building plans. So those have already been completed. I mean, you can state that those professional requirements need to be met, but it's already inherent in
It
our
is,
codes
okay.
that you have to do that. My concern is more along the lines of causing no injury to adjacent property. I mean, how do we determine if that's been done or not? I mean, they can certainly meet all the codes of the city and the building code, but say 5 years down the line, the tree dies, how are we going to go back and determine whether or not there was been some type of injury to that property? I mean, these are private property matters between the two property owners.
So then more specifically, maybe we need to require a landscape or arborist
Yes.
approval that the landscaping isn't creating an injurious or detrimental condition to an adjoining property. Because a civil engineer can structurally define a wall and place it on any type of substrate that will support that wall to withstand seismic, water, you name it, whatever type of movement that would happen between the north properties and the south properties. The real question here is are the grade changes affecting the landscape and potentially creating erosion conditions, which a arborist or landscape architect would be the professional entity. A civil engineer, probably not so much. They move dirt. That's what they're good at, and calling out grades.
I mean, if you're concerned with the trees, I think that you would require a tree protection plan be submitted by a certified licensed arborist. I don't know that you can say that there's not going to be any type of damage to the root system, because I'm sure that depending upon how large the root system is, that there is going to be. Whether or not that's going to cause mortality to the tree, I'm not, hard to speculate.
Marshall?
Well, Joe, I think we don't have enough information, actually. I mean, we don't know if the tree's on the property line, if it's, maybe Ann can clarify that for us where it is?
I was actually going to say, if you guys could actually stand in that alley and see, you can see it, if you had a chance to go over there, but the tree is right on the property line. And the problem is, in the alley is at a certain grade, and then the backyard behind the yellow house is about 4 feet up. And my property is about at the same grade. So if you excavate that 4 feet, you're gonna excavate 4 feet of the roots of the tree. And if you put in a parking space where that handicap stall is, you've killed the tree. There's no way that handicap space can be where it is and the tree survive. I mean, the possibility is you don't, if you.
And could you get this microphone, please?
You know what? I totally spaced that. They didn't pick that up.
Whose property is a tree on?
Okay. This is Ann Marshall speaking, 419 East First Street. I'm trying to clarify regarding the sequoia tree. It's right on the property line. And the problem is that the yard of that property and the backyard behind the yellow house are at a certain grade that's about 4 feet above where the alley is. So if the intention is to put a parking space that's accessed from the alley, you're going to have to excavate about 4 feet. If you excavate 4 feet of soil where those roots are, you're going to kill the tree. So, I mean, one potential solution is don't put a parking space, don't put a parking space right there.
An arborist would be able to give us a fair assessment versus
Correct.
So,
anybody
Correct.
else's. So maybe to answer Mike's question, to clarify how the city would know whether they've met this criteria is that we have an arborist address the civil drawings to verify that as drawn, they would not create an injurious condition to the adjoining property, which is what this criteria states. Is that what you're looking for?
Well,
That's-
what happens if they say that there is gonna be damage to the tree? Does that just mean that they don't receive approval for the conditional use permit? And the tree essentially, stops the whole project? Is that, I mean, I'm just looking for
I would
clarification.
suspect that an arborist could give us alternate. I'm not an arborist.
where is the tree? We've said the tree's on the property line. Is it truly well and truly on the property line, or is it on?
Sorry,
Can just show me where this thing is? I hear it's on the property line. Is it?
sorry.
Yeah, who owns the tree?
Where's the laser thing on?
Yeah, who owns the tree? That's the,
I'm not sure, I don't think it's on this one.
well, I mean, yeah. Who owns the tree? Because if it's their tree, they can take it out if they want.
Yes.
I mean, Ann,
Cheap thing to do, but they could.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Who pays for the arborist?
The applicant. It's part
So where do
it's
you-
part of the cost of that project,
Okay, so the tree is right about here.
because
So-
the city won't.
So
You agree with that, Nils? Is that what you think it is?
It-
I mean, both parties need to agree with this tree.
Well, and the
It's-
reason it's significant to me is because depending on who owns the tree, the question I would have is, let's say the applicant owns the tree. Is there anything stopping the applicant from just taking the tree out as part of this project?
No.
No, there's no
No, 'cause it's
local
not in the
ordinance
right
that
of way.
requires
Okay, and
preservation
that's
of
to
trees.
me why I think it's significant in terms of, we've been talking about the tree is on the property line, but is it really on the property line? Do we know?
it's, well, it's right within my property. And
Okay, so
maybe
it's on your property.
it's right, it's on my property.
Okay.
Now, a solution would be to
Hey,
get,
hold on. No more discussions from the floor. It's not on the mic, it's not part of the public hearing. I've closed the public hearing. I've been tolerant, but I'm done, okay? I asked Ann to come up, clarify where the tree is. I think we could actually look at the site photograph and assess roughly where it is.
I'm just going to suggest something rather than killing the project, which is if this part weren't excavated, then the tree would be okay. If there were one less parking space, and that's a terrible space for a handicap spot, quite frankly.
Thank you, Ann. So let's get back to where we're at here. We have a motion, we have a second, but before we vote on that, the city wanted clarification as to how we would address a drawing from a licensed professional that met the third criteria of that it would not be injurious or detrimental to adjoining properties. And based on the discussion, it sounds like something from an arborist would qualify. Mike?
Well, I mean, it's generate nuisances that would be injurious or detrimental. I mean, the construction is not a nuisance. You're looking at noise, dust, glare, vibrations. That's something that the use is creating that's causing a nuisance, not what's happening during construction.
Well, you know, and Mike brings up a good point. I mean, from a legal perspective, I guess, if this thing got approved and the adjoining property owner thought that that was a problem, the adjoining property owner could go to court and petition for some sort of injunction to stop some sort of building from going on. I mean, that's, if you look at it from that perspective, that's, you know, the adjoining property owner is not without some sort of legal remedy, in particular if, you know, as we're thinking about the tree and does it kill the tree. And my concern was, you know, if the tree is on the applicant's property, then, you know, they can do what they want with it. If the tree that's going to be damaged is on the other property, an adjoining property, that's a different creature. And I think that's what, Joe, you were initially trying to get at.
If the tree is damaged, it's
Yeah.
a nuisance. Physical, sight, shade nuisance, Mike, because it's on the south side of that property, and just given the sun path, they would have no more shade. If that tree died, that's a nuisance. That's how I would define the nuisance, and it is detrimental to the adjoining property, and I don't care whether the applicant likes it, they need to have an arborist do it. I think as a good neighbor, they would want to. We're trying to approve this, we're trying to follow these criteria. I have a motion, I have a second. Have we clarified the criteria for you? Mike?
Well, could you restate number 2? The second condition there about that?
Lorraine, technically, it's your motion. Can I get you to restate the motion and the 2 criteria?
Okay, okay. So moved that the conditional use permit is approved with, subject to the condition imposed by the city of a joint parking agreement between the applicant and the Latah County. And further, that the city obtains certification by a licensed arborist or landscape architect that the project as drawn will not violate the number 2 by causing a nuisance or detrimental or use detrimental to adjoining landowners. I don't have the ordinance and I don't have the criteria language
Yeah,
in front of me,
it's number
but
3.
Which means an arborist could kill the project. You just need to know that.
That's how I read it. So the question I have, and an interesting point was brought up, and I'm looking here at there's there's five parking spots, and an interesting potential.
Seven.
Or, yeah, five and then two, seven, right. Help me understand again the genesis of those seven, because we've granted a variance for parking, and my understanding is this was the proposal to kind of mitigate.
The 7 stalls are the 1-to-4 ratio based on the increased
Okay.
occupant load,
But didn't we?
excluding the balcony, based on
that-
seating.
Okay, so by the variance, and just follow me for a second, by the variance,
Those stalls have nothing to do with the variance.
Okay.
Because the variance is for 11 additional stalls
Sure,
above and
okay.
beyond that, if they build out the balcony.
So Mark, are you
well,
are you thinking of maybe proposing another variance for this?
well,
For this
you know,
particular-
it seems to me that the fly in the ointment here is that ADA parking stall over there that has the potential of causing damage to the neighbor. And my question is, do we need 5 spots right there? Because we've been talking about this all night. Parking isn't gonna increase or decrease really depending on this project. It's gonna stay roughly the same. Those spaces don't exist right now, right? My understanding of the testimony is the church is gonna be used as a church as it's always been used as a church. The new addition and the renovation is gonna make a much nicer building, but it's not gonna increase this. And so I guess, as I'm sitting here looking at it, it seems to me that one of the solutions here is
To provide as
Is-
many stalls as that section would provide without being detrimental to adjoining
right,
properties.
right. And right now, they've got 7 in, or they've got 5 in there right now, and I think the reason, so I understand that the reason they were trying to do it is they're trying to mitigate whatever potential parking problems there is, but in mitigating the potential parking, what we essentially done is created, I think, a huge problem for the neighbors, and that there's a valid concern there, and as I understood, Ann, she seemed to suggest that if you don't excavate, or, you know, that could be a potential solution. What I don't know, and again, this is not this is your
I've
expertise.
got a suggestion, Joe.
Is that something that we've dealt with already, or can we?
I've got a suggestion, but I've got to ask Mike a question. Mike, we've already approved the variance. Can we approve the conditional use permit knowing that there's going to be 7 additional spots, but let them have the latitude to redesign the site plan to locate that ADA spot in a different location? Say that, I mean, looking at this site plan, I could see there's a play area that may accommodate it. There's the shed area that may accommodate it. Can we approve the conditional use permit, giving them the latitude to alter the site plan?
I mean, I think you can articulate that in the motion.
Okay, well, we've got a motion on the floor now,
So we have a
so.
motion on the floor, so we can't really do anything at this point other than clarify your concern as how we would justify dealing with number 2.
So
Well,
if
I
this
mean,
motion fails,
If this
Certainly
motion fails, then we would start
with a different
with
motion.
a, with a
Believe you could
different motion. that
withdraw
would-
the motion.
I mean, I could simply withdraw the motion and we could recraft, because I agree that if there would be flexibility in how the parking spaces were located, so that would be a solution, a much easier one.
Okay, so
So-
the motion on the
Withdraw-
floor has been withdrawn.
So Mark, where I think I was going, where I thought you might have been taken is another variance for the conditional use permit that drops it from 7
To 6.
to 6.
Or can we redesign
Yeah, I
that?
think
Well, as long as it's possible to redesign, I don't know where another 88 parking place can fit there. Go ahead, Marshall.
Joe, I have the latitude to make a motion now.
Can you give me just a few minutes? I'm going to draft as fast as I can on a piece of paper that I don't know is accurate. Mike, just in terms of parking, we think that those stalls that are parallel are 8 feet, and that the aisle is 15, And what's the diagonal between the aisle and the curb? Do you know what that distance is? What I'm wondering is if there's enough depth there between the curb and what the adjacent property owner is going to let them borrow to have perpendicular parking rather than angled parking.
To answer your first question, it's 19 feet from where the travel aisle is to the curb.
Remember, this is one way. I think
The
the
traffic aisle width is actually 12 feet.
the correct way into this is from the west across the back parking lot to take a right, and it's a one-way down to Second Street. Does that have to do, is that why it's diagonal, because it's easier to back out and go forward? Or if they were perpendicular, would that be a turning radius problem?
It'd be a turning radius problem. They need 24 feet if they're perpendicular. That's why the ADA spot works up there with the current
Yeah,
location.
yeah.
I guess my question is, I mean, we're talking about, again, 5 spots on the subject property and then the 2 on the other.
Well, we already know the ADA's on the wrong side of the building. Why can't it be one of the diagonal ones and we just leave that other one up and we reduce the parking from 7 to 6?
The retaining wall would still be there. Well, you'd eliminate that one.
But you don't have to excavate them.
Marshall?
Take a hand at trying a new motion.
Fair enough.
I move approval of the conditional use permit under the condition that there be 7 parking spaces provided and that we give the applicant the flexibility to alter the site plan to protect the neighbor's fence entry.
So basically,
They could relocate that ADA parking spot in a different area.
Did what I hear you say, Marshall, that allows the neighbor then to have to be appeased by the new plan? Is that what
No.
Okay.
No, I just gave the applicant the flexibility to
Yeah.
but it's
to
actually,
protect the tree.
it's actually not the stall that's the issue, it's the retaining wall.
Well, they could,
Or whether that's
they
a
could take the
handicap
retaining
stall
wall,
or a normal stall.
they could
it's still-
take the retaining wall, and when it got to the tree, angle it back to the south, and it still might give access. Maybe they could utilize that place where the shed is located to accommodate the parking lot. Accommodate.
Isn't the retaining wall because there's gonna be excavation?
Correct.
But if we don't use it for a parking place, do they still have to excavate?
But where it comes close to the tree, if they angled the retaining wall to the south to get further away from the tree, it gives the applicant some flexibility to redesign it.
You still think they would need the 7 parking spots then? Your motion has 7
Well, we
parking
passed
spots.
that variance 4-7.
Yeah.
No, that was for,
Well, the most simple design solution at this point, without knowing exactly where the tree is you just take that whole thing and you mirror it and you go in from the south and out instead of in and out. And then all of a sudden, that little diagonal section to the southwest of the last stall ends up becoming negative space up there where the little ADA logo is. So you just kind of reconfigure that.
Right.
But without knowing grades and without knowing true site dimensions, I think we're allowing them to reconfigure that in a different way to still accommodate that, but still meet number 3 and not be detrimental to adjoining properties.
Correct.
And
The
And
variance was for 11 parking lot spots, not
no,
7.
no.
So the seven is
11
unrelated to
11
what we're
was
doing
for,
tonight.
for the
The
balcony.
Do we even have an
which
ability
we-
to adjust the seven?
It kind of
Variance that we approved
Yes,
for 11, not 7.
yeah,
Oh,
no, this is a different.
Right,
They
right.
need a total of 17,
Yeah, but we've already waived 11,
correct.
so
We're
why don't
trying,
we waive one more for this one?
we
Are
could,
we
but the
even-
thought
do we
is.
have an ability to do that? I
reconfigure it.
mean, under the. To be candid, I'm not worried about the number of parking spots right there, whether it's 4, whether it's 5, whether it's 6. I don't think that's the issue. That's not the elephant in the room. It's what is this gonna do to the neighbor's property?
Adjoining properties.
So, and I guess my question is, legally, do we have the ability to reduce that down from 7 to 6 to 5? Mike, is that even something that's before us tonight, or is that within our realm of possibility?
I get there, you know, I think you could certainly reconsider the variance and increase it to waive 12 instead of 11.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't do another variance, is that what I'm hearing?
Or it
It's
sounds to
tied
me like,
just to this
we
CUP?
can go back to the variance that we already approved, we can reconsider it, because we waived
11.
11, and what we would do is waive an additional 1 or 2, and,
So we could reconsider as long as it's unanimous, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you could,
I move that we reconsider the approved variance of an hour ago.
Second.
From 11 to 12?
Correct.
I second that.
Further discussion?
so, okay, so we're backing up to.
well, and I think the theory is, it would, you know, if we're talking about, we approve that, it gives the applicant even more flexibility to do.
To protect the neighbors.
To protect the neighbors because it sounds to me like the applicant's got this on there because they're trying to do the best they can to mitigate a parking problem that, you know.
And 7 is just too tough to do.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean,
So
7,
we're
I mean,
going
if
to
you've got
say
7
they have
right
to be
there, I mean,
6.
I think the testimony's pretty clear, 7 in the way it's designed, I accept the testimony that that's gonna create a problem for the neighbor. I mean, and I think you said that at the outset, so if we can not have to, those 4 diagonal spots, or those 5 including the ADA, that's not right, that's not there right now, and I can justify that by saying, based on the testimony, you know, the church use isn't gonna increase based on this, parking's not gonna change. Parking's not gonna change based on what we have right now, which those don't exist, so,
Okay, we have a
you know,
motion on
to
the
be
floor.
candid, you could almost just eliminate those if you wanted to, and,
Well, they'd also have to eliminate or reconfigure the retaining.
Yeah.
I just,
So-
before we
It
vote
seems
on a motion to back up, I want to make sure the motion is in the best interest of moving forward, not backwards.
I think if we could cut out 1 parking spot in the ADA up on the northwest corner there, if we could just put the retaining wall maybe at the bottom of that ADA parking spot and leave a
Well, we
lot
gotta go
more
through the
room.
motion to reconsider first, and then we can talk about
Yeah.
that.
so I think it,
I think a motion to reconsider is
Recon-
non-debatable motion also.
I'm sorry, what, say that
It's a
again?
non-debatable motion. You just have to vote on it.
Okay, so I have a motion, someone seconded it. Tim did? Okay, so we have a motion and a second to rescind our variance approval. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay.
Lorraine,
Aye.
okay, you ayed. I wasn't sure. All right, so it's unanimous. Okay, so, back to that, if I understand where you're going with this,
Okay.
you want to change that variance.
Yeah. I move approval of the variance to accept 6 additional parking spaces and give the variance for 12 spaces. I think that math is correct.
It was 11.
It was
But-
11 and we
but we're
just
not-
added.
But those
12.
11 are associated with the balcony, so are you suggesting that we continue with the variance for the 11 associated with the balcony and have a variance for 6 related to the main auditorium.
Correct. The net effect of which would be to essentially eliminate one of those spots to give more
To
flexibility.
allow flexibility on
for a
site
conditional
plan to
use
protect
permit.
adjoining
The
properties.
lot.
So you're essentially waiving 12 parking spaces.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
But we're,
Instead
but
of
we're
allowing-
trying to associate them with the uses that were creating the counts to begin with.
And
The 11 were associated with the balcony, which, quite frankly, again, is a bid alternate, they may not do.
And with that motion, I would direct staff to prepare a draft of relevant criteria and standards for us to look at.
Does anybody foresee any reason to give them more flexibility and lessen in even one more space?
I don't think so. I think, depending on direction and widths and grades, they might be able to squeeze 7 in there and still protect the north properties. But by giving them 6, I think, one, it's less pavement. It will be, it costs them less to actually build. But I think
We
5 is.
just don't know what
is
the
a-
roots are gonna look like to that tree, that's all.
I think we're on the right track. I think 1 gives them flexibility. 2 would, I mean, we just eliminate 2 and be done. I'm comfortable with 6.
Okay,
So if they don't exercise their bid, their alternate, and not build out the balconies up there, what do they end up with then? We've given them a variance for 12.
Well, that's why I think we should word it the way that I described. The variance is for the 11, with an additional variance to eliminate the 7 parking stalls down to 6
Which are
associated with the main
auditorium.
auditorium seating.
Actually gives them a variance for 12 then.
It does, but they're associated differently.
Yeah, because they may not build out the ultimate. Not even need the 11.
Right, and so if that was the case and they didn't accept the bid alternate, then theoretically, if they get to exclude 12, they wouldn't have to even build those, the way it's worded. They're still on the hook to build 6 instead of
Correct.
7 for their base bid.
Correct.
The 11 is irrelevant.
Yes. The 11 or slash 12 is,
Right.
should they do the balcony restoration?
But that's what they're proposing,
Right,
to do the balcony.
Right.
right.
So
Yeah,
I
their-
think,
their-
I think we
Their,
just-
their infrastructure, as was mentioned earlier, is part of their base bid, so their intention is to do that. But if funding is just not readily available, or they can't do it within the time frame of what you mentioned, the year or the 2 years of being into that, they'd still be able to continue with base bid and a parking lot with 6 stalls that just doesn't encroach as far to the north without knowing where funding and stuff comes from.
Well,
to
I think
fully-
you can approve that, so you have a variance approved for 12 parking spaces.
That's what my motion is.
And there's been testimony that that may be in the future, you could certainly specify within a certain period of time that needs to be constructed as far as the mezzanine, the balcony area. But, how we would view that is that you waive 12 parking spaces. If 5 years down the line, I mean, they're already vested at that point, we really don't have that 2-3 year issue because that's part of their whole long-term plan. That's part of the CUP.
And they don't have to come back.
So we would say that they wouldn't have to, it wouldn't expire. If they started construction on the part that they're planning on, it would vest them at that point, and they wouldn't need to
Come back and
start the mezzanine in 3 years. They could start that at some point in the future beyond that, and they would still be under the eligibility for the 12 spaces that you approved a variance for. So I don't think you need, in my opinion, I don't think you need to specify draw a distinction between the two. I think you just approve a variance for 12 parking spaces, and it is what it is. They can utilize that into the future as they see fit. If they plan on doing the mezzanine, they have those additional waived off-street parking spaces that they can fully realize what they plan, with their plans.
I still don't know that I agree, because if you get a variance for 12, not associated with anything, and you don't build the balcony for 2 years, then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are 7 of the 12 that I'm going to exclude right now until I build a balcony.
I think if when we go to the next step to approve the conditional use permit, and those are on the site plan.
And clarify that, then. See, I'd be okay with that. I just, to have a variance to exclude 12 of a potential 17 could happen in any of those locations at any spot without them being dedicated to the use that they're associated with.
Well,
I'm not saying they would do that. I'm just saying
you gotta-
it's a
you gotta think
loophole that,
In the relevant criteria, in the findings, we would lay that out, where the spaces were dedicated to certain.
yeah, I think they can address
Parking
I think they
space.
could too. Yeah.
I just want to make sure. We're throwing it back at you to create all the wording to this really long meeting, so.
That's okay, we're doing this, I think we're doing this
Okay,
right.
call for the
We're-
question.
Okay. Give me a motion.
I move approval of the variance, waiving the requirement for 12 parking spaces, and direct staff to prepare relevant criteria and standards for us to review at our next meeting.
Okay, I have a motion, I have a second. Do I have a second?
I thought it said second.
Second.
Okay. Tim beat you to it. I have a motion, I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, that is unanimous. All right. Now we're back down to the conditional use permit.
Okay.
Do you have,
My motion would be to approve the conditional use permit. And give, with the condition that the site plan is redesigned to accommodate or to protect the neighbor's property, including the tree, and that they can, in that redesign of the site plan, they can accommodate the ADA where it fits the best.
and be limited to 6 stalls
Pardon me?
instead of 7?
Right.
And go down to 6 with the
Correct.
ability,
Yeah.
the flexibility to do just 6 stalls?
Correct, and that was done, I thought, with the variance, so,
Okay.
yeah. And I direct staff to develop standards and relevant criteria for us to look at our next meeting.
Before I get a second, Mike?
I'm sorry to continue to bring this up, but.
No, that's what you're paid for, Mike.
It's more of, how about just like for consideration of the tree, not necessarily protection of the tree? I don't want to run into a situation where all of a sudden the neighbor comes to us and said, they didn't protect the tree, and where we're going to be left as far as in between more of a private property dispute between the Unitarian Church.
I mean, that's okay, but I think if you say in consideration of the tree, they say, yeah, we considered it, and what does that mean in a legal standpoint?
Actually, and maybe Mark or Lorraine can answer this for me. I was thinking that instead of using the term protection of the tree, that we use the verbiage that's actually in that third
Yeah.
criteria.
Absolutely. I think the closer we can track the criterion, the more we can rely on precedent that interpreted that same criterion in the past also, so. Yeah, because this way, it's also a more broader protection to the community's interest than simply the interest of one landowner and one tree.
No, I made the motion. I agree with what you just said, Joe, so what's the correct terminology? I would
Restate your motion.
restate my motion.
Well, what about shifting, allowed the applicant to redesign the parking lot in order to shift the off-street parking spaces to the south for consideration of the applicant's tree? I mean, it,
up the applicant's tree
you know, I
though.
mean, it's specifically saying shifting parking to the south. We allowed the reduction of the parking spaces. You know, I just have still some concern over criteria number 3, just because I don't see this as a nuisance.
No, but I think it's injurious to the property.
But
It's not
really,
yet-
nuisances are the only thing that, you know, 3 is specifically about nuisances
Yeah.
being injurious or detrimental to the property.
I guess I'll stand with my motion then, the wording of my motion. I don't think, Mike, I want them to give the latitude, not necessarily to shift the property to the south, but they may want to use it in a different location, so I want to give them the latitude to redesign it, to protect the neighbor's property and tree.
I have a motion, do I have a second?
Second,
I have a motion, I have a second. All in favor?
aye.
Aye.
Aye. So it is unanimous. And that motion included staff to create the relevant criteria and facts, findings of fact. So ends that. Item 4, board communication. Anything new?
Nope, not at this time.
Okay. Other business, I'm assuming, we had is it Thursday? What day did you have set aside for us to review findings of fact in meeting?
Monday.
Monday. Now, this was a much longer meeting, and it might take longer to generate those. Does that give staff enough time to do that by Monday?
We'll probably have to push it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds,
So we can just communicate with the board and,
For a
figure
future
out
date.
an alternative, meeting date.
Okay.
Yep.
okay. So we'll bag the one for Monday and wait for staff to coordinate with all of us when we can meet to approve minutes. All right, motion to adjourn? Please.
So moved.
I'm good with that.
I have a motion,
Second.
I have a second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye, that's unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you.